My name's Chris Newell, and I'm here from the Agamaw Educational Initiative. I'm also the educational supervisor at the Pequot Museum. This is my work partner and colleague, Endawnis Spears.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome.
I'm originally a member of the Passamaquoddy tribe from Maine. Endawnis is Dene, Ojibwe, Chickasaw, Choctaw. Both of us have been married into the local communities here for about 20 plus years. And so the history that we teach here, Native history in Connecticut, is something that's very important to us because this is our children's history. This is something that we have a vested interest in. So today, as part of our activity, we're going to be working on a focus activity that Agamaw created for the Upstander Academy, which is run by the Dodd Center, the Upstander Project, as well as Agamaw and the Pequot Museum, a 6-day, multi-day focus on genocide and human rights, professional development. This was developed as a way to explore what happened right here in Connecticut. The Pequot War is an example of a native genocide that happened here, right here on the soil that we're standing on. One of the ways that we're combating, the leftovers, or the population still existing with the after effects of that genocide, is the way we started today, with Glenn acknowledging the land that we're on here, because prior to Yukon being here, there was 13,000 years of indigenous occupation of this land. That's we don't necessarily teach very well in our high schools or even our grade schools. So we developed this activity as a way to dig into some of the complexities of the Pequot War. I mean, a lot of you have probably studied a little bit of it, or maybe a lot of it, but you probably focus on the massacre. Those are big events of the war, of course. That is not the whole story of the war. It's not just that there was a massacre and then they would lose the war and then that's the end of the story. There's actually a whole lot more to it. And it focuses on the study of this primary document, the Treaty of Hartford. So just by a show of hands real quick, has anybody ever studied the Treaty of Hartford before? So we have 1, 2, 3, I've got a smattering here. Anybody ever heard of the Treaty of Hartford before? Okay, we got more hands there. But still relatively low numbers when it comes to awareness about this particular document. And this document is important because of what it does here to this land. When we looked at the UN definition, the third one said, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. I think that you'll see this document is an example of that directly. So the war happens, of course, from 1636 to 1638. At the end of the war, the Pequots have lost to the English settlers, and now we have a document that is drawn up called the Treaty of Hartford. So what I have included for you is a couple of handouts. One is the handout that would go along for the students if you were doing this in your classroom. It has a copy of the Treaty of Hartford right after the first page. And then there's a couple of other resources in there. And then there's also another worksheet right here, which is developed by the Library of Congress. It's a way to study primary documents. And this one has been adapted to the Treaty of Hartford activity. And you'll notice the 3 columns: observe, reflect, and question. Those are the 3 basic things that we'll be going through as we go through this document. This is the teacher's version, so it has the consequences of the activity and other things on there for you to be able to follow along with if you wanted to do this in your classroom. So we begin usually with a reading of the Treaty of Hartford, and I would break the room into groups. And we're going to be doing that shortly because I want you to do at least the discussion portion of this particular activity so you can see what you get out of it. But I would typically break the room into groups of about 6 to 8 people, students, per group. And each group would have their own worksheet to be working on here. So essentially the whole group is working on the worksheet. Now we would read the Treaty of Hartford, and one of the things we discover about it is that it's written in 17th century English. It's very, very difficult to understand. Any 17th century document is going to be like that. And that brings us into a discussion of the use of an English language document to define the terms of what happened after the war. And essentially what's going on in this document is the English are making an agreement with the Mohegans and Narragansetts about what to do with the land that they had just conquered from the Pequots and what to do with the population of Pequots that are still surviving. And you're going to find that this English language document has a lot of the characteristics from England. I always tell people that if you speak more than one language, you kind of understand that culture is the blueprint of a language. In the Algonquin dialects that exist here in this region, land cannot be owned as property. In fact, it is something that sustains you. In fact, in my language, in the Passamaquoddy language, when you pick up the soil and drop it out of your hand and let it fall to the ground, that's life falling out of your hand. So we don't have the consideration of land as property. Objects can be property. This bow is mine. This home is mine, right? But the land itself sustains you. It gives you life. So in the Algonquin dialects, it cannot be owned. However, in the English language, land can be owned. So this is a transfer of culture that's happening with this one particular document after the Pequot War. So what we would do is we would, again, read portions of it. We would talk about the difficulty, the language barrier that's going on here, the fact that we have an English document written on paper, and this paper document is now going to be basically the law of the land here. This is a new concept that's arriving here with European settler colonization, and this is something that would take over and become the system of, essentially, the reservation system begins here in Connecticut. As a result of these paper documents that are being generated by the English post-Pequot War.
And Chris, also to just add, this gives you a great opportunity to talk about the documents that you're using as primary documents and the cultural context that they come from. So this particular treaty, all of the colonial maps that you are using in your classrooms, while those are very helpful in understanding a colonialist understanding of the world, which is important, it's also important to think about the parts that are missing from the room. So to think about land in terms of the colonial maps that you're using, having hard and distinguished borders, and they're carving up a piece of land like a butcher's map, and they are conceptualizing map in a certain kind of way. That gives us an opportunity to talk about how Native people traditionally looked at land in completely different ways, as Chris was saying. And so just to take that into consideration to whose story is being told in these documents and whose story is being left out.
Yeah, and to highlight that as well, the name of our state here is Connecticut. In the languages in the tribes in this region here, that translates as the Long Tidal River. And for tribes in my region, way up in Wabanaki territory, it translates as something long and straight. And it was our place name for the Connecticut River. So to Native people, Connecticut is the river. The long, straight river that connects our territories from Wabanaki territory all the way down here. And not the squared out line that we've drawn on the map that we now define as the state of Connecticut. So there's very different concepts to land. Connecticut is the river. And what it does for you, it's not the land itself, it's not this state that we've marked out with lines. Once again, a colonial construct. So we would go through now this is not a study of, you can go into a deep study of the Treaty of Hartford itself if you want to, but what I've done is I work at with the research department at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, who have dissected this document very well. And what I've done is I've broken down the 6 provisions in the Treaty of Hartford into kind of plain English versions here. And what that is as you go through the worksheet, they can list in bullet form here what the 6 provisions basically go over, and I'll go over those really quick. The first one is that there is reconciliation and peace between Mohegans and Narragansetts. All issues from the past are to remain in the past and are never brought up again. The relationship between the Allies and the English is formed here. In the future, Mohegans and Narragansetts will not seek revenge for any wrongdoings, injuries, or otherwise done to each other. These matters must be presented to the English of Connecticut, and they will determine what the appropriate response should be. If either party disagrees with the decisions made, the English of Connecticut will have to enforce the matter. Now, there's an interesting thing that's already starting to happen with that second provision there, is that the power structure is starting to transfer from native control over to English control. Neither the Narragansetts or Mohegans, who are allies in the war, will shelter or hide any enemy of the English and any enemies of the English who previously or consents to harm the English. So they're basically saying if you have any enemies, you're required to turn them over. Whoever first finds Sassacus, which was kind of the point of the war, was to get Sassacus and also the massacre, destroy the head sachem, and that way you take down the people. However, he does escape by the end of the war. So they say that whoever first finds him must turn his head into the English. Mohegans and Narragansetts must also bring any heads of any Pequot involved with the killing of the English. And then we get to a very important provision here. This is what happens to the Pequot people inside of the Treaty of Hartford. And there are some losses that happen to them that are very, very important, which we're going to focus on in the discussion. So the first is the loss of freedom. The remaining Pequots, 200 men plus their families, are to be divided up and sold to the Mohegans and Narragansetts as slaves. We know that number is probably about 700 total if you add up all the women, children, families, and everybody. And there's prices in there. Well, so that's something right there, is that they're divided as slaves to the English, Mohegans, and Narragansetts, but the slaves that are divided up to the Mohegans and Narragansetts, they have to pay a price for every year. In fact, 1 fathom of wampum, white wampum from each adult male, a half fathom for each Pequot youth, 1 hand's length of white wampum for each male child. This payment to be made to the English each year at the time of the hilling of the corn. So they have to pay every year for the right to have the slaves, the Pequots that they took over at the end of the war. The loss of identity. They lose their name in this document. The document says that the Pequots will no longer be called Pequots, but instead will take on the names of either Mohegan and Narragansett. So there's a huge loss of identity there. And also dispossession of land, a loss of land. The Pequots will no longer live on their homelands, about a 250 square mile territory in the southeast corner of Connecticut here. The Narragansetts and Mohegans may not live in former Pequot territory unless the English allow. So once again, you see that power structure, flipping over here. English captives must be returned to the English of Connecticut as well as the English of Massachusetts. And then the very last one here, the threat of war if the treaty is not followed. These agreements must be kept by each party, and if any party should break the terms of this treaty, the other 2 parties may join together and declare war against them unless an agreement can be reasonably made and met. So even though there's a peace being established here, it's a pretty tenuous peace. It's at the threat of war. So it's not exactly the best thing that's going on here. Now, the activity portion of this involves a group discussion and a forced choice activity. So Alan alluded to one of those before. I like to use these as well. And this is kind of an experiential way of learning about the Treaty of Hartford and the decision making that went into it back at that time. So the way it's going to work is we're going to do our best to group up, sections of people that are kind of already grouped up. We can make 4 large groups here, that's totally fine. Because what I want you to do is I want you to engage in the discussion here, because that's very important. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the role of the oppressor here. And in my role, these 3 losses, you guys are playing the role of the oppressed in this particular case. Freedom, identity, and land have a lot to do with how natives exist in this world. And you've been taken, all 3 of these have been taken away from you in this document, basically erasing you, all right? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a choice. You have a choice as a group to keep one of those losses. You can keep your freedom. You can keep your identity or you can keep your land. You cannot keep all three. You can only keep one. And you have to choose one. You can't stand up on your soapbox and say that if I don't get all three, I'm not taking any. You have to choose one. Now, what would happen is when the discussion begins, I would give you a time limit. You have 6 minutes to discuss. And the idea is to build consensus amongst your group, trying to make which choice you're going to keep, which loss are you going to keep, freedom, identity, or land. And so this involves deliberation versus debate. To build consensus is a native form of governance, which is different than democracy, which means getting everybody to agree. That's going to be a very difficult thing to do, especially in the short time limit that you have. But if you would like, let's see if we can try this out. Let's split this into 4 quadrants. So those ones back there, these ones right here. I'll get a question? I would give them 5 minutes or 6 minutes. I would keep it short, and there's a purpose for that, and I'm going to explain it in just a minute. All right, so yeah, this group up here and then the groups back there. What you're doing is, as a group, you're trying to discuss which loss you're going to keep, all right, at the expense of the other two, all right? So there is no right answer in here, and there's no judgment on what choice that you make. It's just simply, how do you see, with this limited information, how would you discuss this and come up to a decision for yourselves and to make consensus among each other. So let's try that discussion really quick here, just for a few minutes, and let's see what happens when we bring this up. All right, folks, time is up. As hard as it's going to be, I'm going to ask you to end your conversations right where they're at. So, now the first question I have for the 4 groups, were you able to build consensus in your group? No. Were you able to build consensus? How about you guys? No. And this group right here? Close but no cigar, right? Okay. So that's one thing that we learned from this, is that consensus form of governance takes more time. Yet in the Pequot War, we're in a time of war. And so the war actually displaces the governance and causes mistakes to be made on both sides here. But as you can see, you know, the discussion really digs into, what do you keep? You know, all 3 of these things are pretty detrimental to you as a people, but what do you keep? Now, let's just see if we can unpack really quickly what was the majority in this group. Did we have a majority?
Yeah, identity.
Yeah, identity.
Identity, okay. And why was identity the majority for those that were choosing it?
Well, the sense is that without identity, you lose both your past and your future. And with identity, yes, the loss of land, the loss of freedom is temporal, and yet with an identity, you have your history, and you have the potential of passing on that history to a future where there could be the reclamation of other things that one's lost.
Yes. So that's one of the biggest reasons why people would keep identity. However, unfortunately, you have lost your land. You're no longer allowed to live in your land anymore, and you're not free. You're my slaves.
So the only reason I brought this, I tried to do this objectively.
Mm-hmm.
I also have to say I'm new to Connecticut, so this is all new history to me, even. Living in Florida, I can tell you about the Florida scenarios. But as a person who's Jewish and not even related to the Holocaust, I think about the Jewish people without land, without freedoms, throughout history, and only identity is what really enabled my history to be put forward. So I couldn't do it without bringing that perspective.
Mm-hmm. And that's often the case, is that everybody in the group has their own life experiences that contribute to their perspective and how they're seeing what they're valuing over here. And it's a tough decision. I gave you an impossible decision here. There's no right answer. What was the general majority here?
Not much of anything.
Not much of anything? So really we couldn't come to anything on this one, right?
I would say we probably want to put between freedom and identity.
Okay. So yeah, freedom and identity. So if you keep your identity, once again, you remain as your identity. By the way, we would assign identities to you, okay? We would give you not ethnic identities. We would give you kind of generic classroom identities, so mentors, leaders, providers. Those are the group identities that we would give to you. And then one of the things I do is if you give up your identity, I take your identity and I tear it up and I give you the opposite of your identity. And there's a reason why we don't use cultural and ethnic identities in this particular case. Unless you have a homogeneous classroom where all the students are the same ethnic identity, it's not going to work. You're going to have cultural appropriation you're supporting and all kinds of things like that. So use what's effective in your classroom. What do your students aspire to be inside your own classroom? Leaders, providers, teachers, you know, those are the things that I chose, but it's not like you can't choose your own things. The group back here, what did you guys come to an idea on?
We suppose that if we ranked the three, the one that would average the highest was
freedom. Okay, so they keep their freedom, but you lose your identity. So whatever identity I had given you, you not only lose it, you get the opposite of it. So if you were a leader, you are now never going to be seen as leaders again. You are going to be followers at all times. You are always going to be looked at that way. And also, you have lost your land. So you are free, but you're not allowed to live on the territory where all your ancestors grew up. All of that is now gone, and you're never allowed to come back again. So that's unfortunate for the consequences there. But what did we come as a general majority decision in this group here? It's a really big group, so. Freedom and identity. All right, so we had a lot of, and this really goes all over the place. I really have different choices come up every single time, and some groups do come up with consensus. All right, so I'm going to end the activity portion right there for you guys. That was just a taste of how this goes, and we have a limited amount of time. But now let's unpack this a little bit. If you were doing the worksheet, the provision, you would list the bullet provisions on the first one. The one that you would keep is in the second one right here, and you would justify why as a group, of course. And then the last thing is what questions are coming up for you now as a part of this. And this is where we unpack this a little bit more. What questions come up as the discussion? What was interesting about your discussions in general? Just a couple of comments about that.
If you had your freedom, you could move westwards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so you can inform yourself with, different ideas of what can happen in the future based on what's happened in the past, and there's all kinds of different thoughts when it comes into the room, and that's one of the hard reasons why it's difficult to build consensus in such a short amount of time, and that's why I give you a very limited amount of time, because that's what folks would have been going through during this period where they're experiencing these conditions that deliberately are destroying their culture, and they don't know how to quite get out of it. And if you look at Native people in general, freedom, identity, and land are all interconnected. They all bleed together. They can't really separate one from another without damaging the other two. And yes?
and this is probably beyond scope, if I am free, can anybody take my identity?
That's a good question. You can make your argument in your discussion for that particular that case right there, and that would be your justification for why you would keep freedom over identity. And so I don't tell you what to choose. You can inform yourself with, a lot of you guys are informed with a lot of information here, and you can bring that into the discussion. Some folks aren't informed, and that causes, a different type of dynamic in the discussion. But what it does is it forces the students to think about what was happening to the Pequots here, what the conditions were that were deliberately destroying their way of life. Now, I just want to bring up a couple of other things about the Treaty of Hartford really quickly. There is more than one copy of the Treaty of Hartford. So the copy in the handout that I gave you, the first one that we looked over is the one that's in the Connecticut Science Museum. The Yale Indian Papers has a copy of it online, so you guys can get it there, but there's a copy of it in here. If you notice at the end of the document, the signature is dated June 28, 1743. The end of the Pequot War was in 1638. So this is a signed copy, a certified copy that was made 105 years after the signing of the Treaty of Hartford. So this is not actually the Treaty of Hartford. And in fact, there is a second copy that was found in Great Britain. And the one in Great Britain was signed not in 1743, but in 1665. So much, much closer to the date of the war, and it's actually longer. There are, those 6 provisions that we went over are where the 2 documents agree with each other, but in the British copy, there are additional provisions in there that just kind of go into what Native people, the power structure that's flipping over here. So additional provisions that are written in there. Narragansetts and Mohegans will not enter into each other's territories without permission, will not steal wampum furs or burn wigwams. Once again, trying to keep peace. Narragansetts, Mohegans, and their dogs will not harass or destroy English cattle or pigs. If English cattle stray into Mohegan or Narragansett territory, they shall be brought back to the English, and the English shall compensate them for any damage. The English aren't, for some reason, aren't responsible for keeping their own cattle. It's up to the Narragansetts and Mohegans here. If knowledge of wrongs are being planned against the English are discovered, the other party must report to the English or apprehend those making such plans and bring them to the English. So this is, once again, more protection for the English. If an English boat wrecks in Mohegan or Narragansett territory, or English goods or men must be collected and returned to the English. So once again, the onus goes on to the Narragansetts and Mohegans. If an English boat wrecks, you have to find our goods and turn them into us. And just to note, other provisions are also included, up to 13 total. So that we had 6 in the one that we looked at before. This one has up to 13. However, it is ripped and damaged, so we don't have the complete all 13 provisions in there. We just have more of an idea of what was going on in the document. Yes, sir. This one is the earliest copy that we have. We don't have the real Treaty of Hartford. And that's something that's, that 1743 copy was considered the Treaty of Hartford for about 200 years. It wasn't until this other copy came about that people started to look at the dates and said, oh, wait a minute here. We really need to examine this a little bit better. So, immediate impacts of the Treaty of Hartford. Once again, we were creating conditions that deliberately inflict upon the group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part. One of those biggest things is the reversal of power that happens in this paper document up until 1638. The English settled and worked in the region with the permission of the Pequots and other tribes. So they came here and made settlements in Hartford, Wethersfield, and Windsor with the permission of the tribes in this region. And this is flipping over now. English dominance is now established. The language in the document treats allies like the Narragansetts and Mohegans with a sense of inferiority, and all disputes must be decided by the English alone. Establishes a large land base for English settlers in Connecticut. Pequot territory is now claimed by the English for themselves. Pequots nor their allies, Narragansetts and Mohegans, are permitted to live in or enter former Pequot territory without the permission of the English. They protect English lives and their goods, but does not do the same for the tribes. English goods arriving from ships, people, and even their cattle are given protections in the Treaty of Hartford, but none of these protections are extended to Mohegans or Narragansett. And though it attempts to establish peace, it does so under threat of war. No guarantee of an end to hostilities or atrocities. In fact, if one of the allies commits hostility against the other, the Treaty of Hartford gives permission for 2 of the other parties to go war if the treaty is breached. So essentially, it's setting up another genocide. It's setting up the conditions for a future genocide if the English felt that it was necessary. So this document right here really should be taught, in my opinion, not just at the Pequot Museum. We should really be teaching this in every American school, not just as a part of Pequot history, but a part of Connecticut's history and a part of the American story here, because without the English winning this war and this document being drawn up, them taking over the power, they essentially create a little New England in the southeast corner of Connecticut and expand their power outward from there. The Dutch who are here in Connecticut get driven out. New Amsterdam becomes New York. Eventually the English take over all the colonies, and we have a Declaration of Independence from the country of England. The domino that begins that is the genocide of the Pequots. This document right here is a continuation of that, past the mass killing, creating deliberate conditions to destroy their culture. The long-term impact of the Treaty of Hartford, we have a population right now, the Mashantucket Pequots and the Eastern Pequots, by the way. The fact that the Eastern Pequots are not a recognized tribe and the Mashantucket Pequots are, even though they are all the same people, is actually a continuation of genocide as well. They're, literally the federal government is not supporting the reconstruction of the Eastern Pequots. So from Rodney Butler, chairman of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation, he talks about the long-term impacts on the community now. The Treaty of Hartford demonstrated that regardless of how determined an enemy is to destroy us, we will survive. After the Pequot War ended, our ancestors faced insurmountable adversity such as persecution, slavery, identity theft, indentured servitude. That's another thing where they're taking Native children. So that's another part of that UN definition right there. Because the intent behind the treaty was to wipe out our existence after a failed attempt of genocide at the Mystic Fort. So we see a population right now that is dealing with the good and the bad of rebuilding themselves about 400 years post-genocide right here in Connecticut. So there is a tremendous resource in the Pequot Museum to learn about this to learn about the Pequot War and what happened there. If the museum is too tough of a trip, which I know it's an expensive trip to go there, that's one of the reasons why Agamau Educational Initiative came about, is to create activities to bring these conversations into your classroom in an effective way. And we can do this as a classroom activity or a professional development for teachers so that teachers can teach this material and bring this discussion into your classroom here. When you want to talk about the genocide of Native peoples, it really starts with the Pequot War here, right here in this region. We're standing on the soil where it happened, and it should not be forgotten. Anything left?
Yeah, well, I think that as we kind of summarize and look at the impacts of the Treaty of Hartford, there's some key things that we should remember, and one of them is that what does a population look like after it survives genocide 500 years later? And I think that that's a really interesting lens to look at genocide through. For Native people who are living here in New England and across the United States and through the Americas, we look at our homeland and our existence here in this country as survivors, as people who are living within an occupied territory. And so it gives you an opportunity to kind of bring these events up into the 21st century, into the lived experiences of Native people who are alive today. And I think that that's something that we can look at when we look at genocide in general. What does genocide look like 500 years later? How are communities employing mechanisms that ensure resilience and survivance? And then what can we do within our non-Native and Native communities living together to ensure, again, prevention, talking about that motivation of prevention within our classrooms and our communities and our shared histories that go beyond this. So that's a really unique way of looking at genocide from a Native perspective here in the Americas. And this is a difficult conversation to have because it is so politicized. It's much more comfortable to talk about genocide when it happened a long time ago and far away and completely unrelated to our lived experiences today. And I think that this activity and looking at how Native communities had a shortened amount of time to make very important decisions for their people allows students to think about the decisions that Native people had to make in very short amount of time. So I think that there's a lot of conversations that can be had about this, and I think that some of these activities can spark those conversations. I hear a lot of teachers talk about how difficult it is to engage with Native histories because they feel as though they're not Native American, so how can they speak to this particular subject? And I think that that's where we come into having support services like Agamau, the Pequot Museum, and having conversations here like we're having here today.
All right. Any last comments? Yes.
Chris, so in comparison to the Holocaust, where there are literally millions of documents available, photos, all the documentation the Germans have, the photos, the video, the diaries people wrote, art that was created, I mean, there's so many sources compared to what you might have to study the Pequot War. What other resources are available out there for teachers, either at your museum or elsewhere in Connecticut, that teachers can draw from?
All right, so there's always other primary sources. So, I mean, most of them are written by the English, though. They're written by the victors. So you're going to get a one-sided account. You know, if you read Mason's account, you get a very one-sided account of the Pequot War. But basically, he does admit to a genocide in that account. If you go to pequotwar.org, pequotwar.org, that is run by the research department at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center. It's very comprehensive what they're doing right now as far as research, an interactive timeline of the war, so you can really go into detail about what events were leading up to the war, what caused the declaration of the war, what events happened during the war, how the Dutch, the English, and the Pequot relationship and all of those ingredients created the soup that we call the Pequot War, you know, can be examined through that website. You can also go to agamount.org, and you can work with us to come in and bring this material in there. And if you want to continue Native wars in this region, King Philip's War, of course, was a uprising against the English in Massachusetts by tribes in that region that would be quashed by them. Essentially, the quashing of King Philip's War, Pometacom's rebellion, causes you know, English influx, you know, from 30,000 to 250,000 people in 25 years after the end of that war. So if you want to examine that war, it's kpwar.org. So.
And also, the Yale Indian Papers
Yes.
Project also has a huge amount of primary sources that you can go to their website and access. Again, it's a one-sided view of this interaction. I think of an example of having the cultural lens and access to a cultural lens to look at other primary sources as examples of this time period. And I think about yesterday was the 343rd August meeting, annual Narragansett Indian powwow that I attended with my family, and it's based around the Narragansett Indian Church, which is there in Charlestown, Rhode Island. And one of the key issues of Indian churches throughout New England is that the pews face the doors. So when you come into like a normal Protestant style church, it's set up like this with the pastor at the front, and the congregation comes in, and the doors to exit are in the back. And if you go into any Indian church in New England today, that is a primary source, because the pulpit is situated between the exit doors, and all of the pews face the doors. And that is a remnant of praying towns. That is a remnant of forced Christianity for Native people here in New England. That was a church was a place where Native people were allowed to congregate legally and be with one another and have conversations with one another, maybe even speak their language, maybe even sing a song in their traditional languages. And they could monitor who was coming in and out of the church. So if someone showed up and they need to switch back into Christianity mode and into English, they could. And so that, to me, is a primary document. And looking at Indian churches, and we set up our churches. I'm a member of the Narragansett Indian Church. And we set up our churches that way and maintain them that way as a remnant to that time period within our history. And so without that knowledge and without that interaction with the Native community around you and engagement, then that is the primary document that you would not have the opportunity to engage with or talk about some of these systemic modes of oppression.
All right, I think now it's lunchtime, right? Yeah.